Welcome to In Conversation with Alethia. I am your host, Alethia O'Hara Stevenson. In this show, I sit down with amazing individuals from our community who are doing incredibly inspiring things. The show will educate, it will empower, and it will inspire you. Today's guest, I am honored to have the amazing Dr. Jasmine Proteau. She is the Museum Services Director for the Museum of Dufferin, and she has an amazing history from her studies abroad to the time she spent working in museums in Europe and her journey right back home to Orangeville. So welcome to the show, Jasmine.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Awesome. So first of all, congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank
So
you.
I'm going to go right into your bio because your story is absolutely fascinating, from traveling to the UK to study, to complete your PhD at Oxford. What inspired you to even want to get into the museum or to study history to start off with?
I've actually been interested in history for as long as I can remember. I actually used to go to elementary school here in Hockley, and I think when I graduated for grade 8, I had history as my top interest. So
wow.
I always knew I wanted to do something with history. I thought I was going to be a professor when I first started, and then I kind of got exposed after my first master's to museum studies and all the kind of more public side of history that I think is more interesting. Working with objects and kind of getting to hold things that have been passed down through generations or have stories attached to them, I think is really special.
That's neat.
It's kind of when you go to a historic place and you feel kind of goosebumps because you're
yes.
I feel like I'm walking in the footsteps of someone before me kind of thing. So that's kind of how I got into it.
That's neat.
Yeah.
Now, you said your first master's. What is your second master's?
So my first master's is in history, and the second master's is in museum studies. So I went to U of T and did it's a 2-year master's program teaching you everything about how to run a museum, all levels. So curation, I spent a lot of time doing curatorial work, which involves preparing the exhibits. And then I'm also specializing in collections management. So all the objects, how to care for them. There's a lot of science involved in that. So
yes.
making sure everything's happy, and basically you want to preserve the life of these things for as long as you can.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's kind of my two areas of specialty.
Fascinating. So what made you decide to go to the UK to complete your PhD?
There were several factors. I was I knew I wanted to work in museums, and it's a very competitive field, so there are very few job opportunities, especially at a curatorial level or manager level. There's just, they don't come up, the jobs don't come up very often, so it's kind of competitive, and I wanted to make sure, I wanted to make sure I could compete. And Oxford is ranked #1 in the world. I think also, they have this kind of rivalry, but it might also be Cambridge. I think they might be tied for #1 in the world for history teaching. So that's kind of why I chose that. But Oxford specifically has a lot of museums in the city itself. So I wanted to do the work for my PhD, but also be able to work in the museum world and kind of keep my foot in that while I was abroad, and I managed to do that. So that's kind of that was the thought behind it. But
that is amazing, and you don't often hear, people talk about having a passion for history and then going down the path of, working in a museum. So that is pretty neat, and it's an unusual but exciting path.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've uncovered some really amazing artifacts during your time, especially in the UK. Can you share some of those?
Yeah. I mean, there's, I guess the UK kind of was especially because of the British Empire and the history of that, which is quite problematic, obviously, but they just have amazing institutions that are open for the public, which I think is it's free to go. They have some of the largest institutions in the world, and so some of the objects they have are just incredible. And of course, there's lots of debate about whether or not they should be there at all. But yeah, I got to, when you hold something that's over 2,000 years old, like a vase or something. I've held like an Etruscan vase that was over 2,000 years old, and you're like, okay, you know, you really feel like you're just connecting with something so beyond yourself that it's yeah, it kind of gives you the goosebumps. At least gives me goosebumps.
Now, do you often have the stories that go with, you know, each artifact? Or do you have to do that research on your own to uncover what the story was behind it?
Yeah, there's kind of that happens. There's kind of both of those. So when museums collect objects, it's very important for the people who are donating. We always try, whenever possible, to get the story behind what it is, because the story is what makes it special.
Yeah.
I mean, there's, you know, it could be anyone's teapot, but if there's a really good story behind what the teapot means and who used it and why, and maybe there was some sort of ceremony or tradition used with it, that gives it so much more context, and I think it makes the object important. So we try to collect that whenever possible, and most of the time we have it. Sometimes it does require extra research, especially if things are uncovered through archaeological digs, or there's different ways that a museum can acquire objects, and that definitely requires a lot of research. We often have to contact specialists, or you know, sometimes there's like forensic, you know, depending on what it is, you know, so it's yeah, it can be, it's a very interesting field of work. You can be, you know, dealing with a mammoth bone one day and a lady's, you know, nightgown the next day. So it's very wide ranging as to what you get to see.
That is fascinating, because when I think of the museum, I don't often think about, you know, the behind the scenes and all the work that goes into it and all the different exciting components. So this is really amazing that I'm able to have this conversation with you right now, because I have a renewed interest in the museum now. Part of your journey, you talked about the fact that, you know, not only were you able to spend time in England, you spent time in Paris, I believe, and Italy as well. Yeah. Were you able to work in the museums there as well and uncover some of the historical aspects from those countries?
So when I was living in France, I lived in Lyon, and I didn't get to work in the museum there, but I did spend a year there, so I was trying to immerse myself in the language. But when I worked in Italy, I worked for it was a German art history library. So they had a really awesome collection of rare books, which actually started my my love of guidebooks, which got me into my PhD work. And so, yeah, I was working with colleagues from Italy and Germany, and so I got exposed to a lot of their different, it's very interesting when you're exposed to different cultural, I think the stories we tell about history changes depending on the country that you're in. And the perspectives of those different versions. So I think that is kind of living in the different countries really exposed to me the fact that, you know, what we're learning here might not be what they're learning there, and kind of gives you an understanding of the fact that history is told by many different people. There's many different perspectives.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, it gives you that sort of nuanced perspective. It's not as black and white as people think. A lot of the time, it's not so binary.
That is so true. And, you know, an important element, especially, you know, why, again, it's so important for individuals to immerse yourself in different cultures and travel, explore.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, you came back home. What was the deciding factor? Like, why home? Why did you think it was important for you to come back home and, you know, work at the museum at home? Yeah,
I've always had a special place in my heart for Dufferin County.
Yeah.
I mean, again, like I grew up here. You know, I used to run barefoot in the woods as a you know, a child. Like I've always loved it here. Yeah. My family is from here. Like my family lives here. Yeah. So there's something about, you know, I guess when you grow older, you know, when you're young, you can't wait to get away and explore. But sometimes as you get older, you just have this sort of need to go back home. And yeah, I've actually been waiting for the, like, because we have the museum here, which is obviously, you know, there's not many museums in rural areas, so I think it's special that we have this one. And I was really excited to see the position come up. So when I saw it, I thought, yes.
It was meant to be.
It was meant to be. So yeah, I've just I wanted to, you know, raise my family here and just, you know, reconnect with the community. So yeah,
it's special. And there's always something special about coming back home and connecting and you know, doing things that, you know, are grounded back in the very community that you started.
Yeah, exactly. So I feel, yeah, just, and I know so much about the place already. It just feels like I'm kind of fitting back into what was already there.
I love it. I love it. Now, in terms of your vision for the museum, obviously Dufferin County has changed so much, especially in demographics over the last 10 years. But even beyond that, our history for Dufferin County has just been, it's rich. What's your vision for, cataloging the rich diversity and history of Dufferin County?
For sure. So we're working really hard in different areas of the museum to really reach out to different communities that have obviously been overlooked or weren't captured originally in what, we have a lot of early settler sort of things. Yes. And we're trying to move beyond, I mean, that's important history as well, but we want to move beyond that and collect things that are, things that people I don't think realize are historical and will be thought of, just as an example, something that's contemporary now, we think, oh, that doesn't belong in a museum. But really it will, because it tells a story of what we are as a culture and what's going on right now in the world. And then, 100 years from now, that's going to be really fascinating to somebody. Yeah. So I think some things that we're doing in terms of like how we're actually trying to do that is we have a few different initiatives. Right now we're doing something called collecting the community. So we started that last year, and it's basically going out and building relationships with diverse communities, making sure that they know that we're, we are interested in their stories, we want to collect their stories, we want to hear their perspectives. If they have, tangible, sometimes it's intangible, sometimes it's just a story that they have, but also sometimes it's maybe, your grandmother's quilt, whatever it may be, that tells a story about your culture and what's important to you. And so we're trying to, build that. We did that last year, and then we're actually hiring, hopefully, fingers crossed, we've applied for a grant for a summer student to continue the work this year as well.
That's amazing.
So we're really trying to get, I think, things that help us to tell the story, because especially in an exhibit or something, if we're thinking about what we're going to want to do later on, you need to have the things to show and the stories to tell if you're going to create like a cohesive story. We also have a really great, actually we have a call for entry that just went out recently for the multicultural art show that we're having called Unity and Diversity. Yes. So some people might remember that we had this last year, and we're doing it again this year. So we're hoping that we have lots of artists of all different, there's no age limit. So there's different openings for different people. If they have any art that they would like to share, we'd be very happy to see it. And so it'll be a call for entry. So if anyone's interested, we would welcome them submitting their work.
That's awesome.
So we've got a couple things, and of course that's going to also be followed by Multicultural Day, the event, the celebration. So
love it.
Yeah, and we've also been working really hard with our to outreach to different Indigenous communities, and this Friday, so on March 3rd, we have an opening for Our Story.
Okay, love it. Okay.
It's an exhibit.
Awesome.
We're going to pause it.
We're going to take a quick break, and we're going to pick up on that conversation when we return. So thank you for joining us in Conversation with Alethia. We'll be right back with our Indigenous stories for this Friday at the Museum of Dufferin.
Hey folks, it's me, Giovanni Patini, the host of the RTV quiz show, the hottest show on television. It's the hilarious quiz show where you, the viewers, play for valuable non-existent prizes. It's got great trivia, fun facts, and a lot of laughs, all blended together in a perfect cocktail of edutainment. So join us Wednesdays at 7:30 right here on Rogers TV. Nice.
You're watching Rogers TV.
Welcome back to In Conversation with Alethia. I'm in the studio with Dr. Jasmine Proteau, Museum Services Manager for the Museum of Dufferin. So we left off the conversation talking about, all of the amazing things that the museum is doing at cataloging the diversity of Dufferin County and starting with Indigenous history. So I know you have an event coming up, but beyond the event, what else are you doing to catalog, the rich history, specifically, or Indigenous history right here from Dufferin County?
Yeah, for sure. So last year, as a part of our Collecting the Community initiative, we went through our collection to look at what we had that was related to Indigenous history. We did a full sort of inventory and making sure, so part of Decolonizing museum work is to go through and look at how things have been cataloged in the past. The type of language that's used isn't always contemporary anymore, so we've been changing that. We also talked to some Indigenous elders and showed them what we had and said, is any of this ceremonial, anything important that we should be thinking about repatriating? They said no, so we're trying to do our due diligence to make sure that whatever we have is being collected with conscious care and displayed with the same conscious care and making sure that the communities feel like they're involved in how we're displaying their stories and their objects. But we are, of course, always interested in collecting more because there's such a gap. And this isn't just Museum of Dufferin, it's all over Canada. I think everybody has this same, especially rural community museums. We all have this problem of the fact that we weren't collecting what we should have been collecting back then. So it's a little harder to do it in hindsight because, of course, there are so many things that got lost in time, which is a shame. But I think it's better late than never. So we're really trying to try and encourage those communities to feel that this is a place for them and that they can, leave there if they have stories or objects that we would be very happy to share that.
And I love the fact that you touched on the fact that the museum is doing the work. And this is one of the things that I often, say I'm proud of about Dufferin County. Dufferin County is willing to do the work to decolonize the language, decolonize, how information is presented in the museum. And that is an important aspect when it comes to honoring the communities that you're serving. So kudos for the museum for doing that work. It's important. Very important,
yeah. And other ways that we're trying to do it is recognizing that, of course, although Indigenous history is very rich, there are a lot of people who are currently living here that are Indigenous. So it's not so much, we're not just looking at the past and going, okay, that's in the past. They are part of our community today. So we've been working with trying to get more Indigenous artists in the museum. We have an art show going on from starting on March 3rd and going until the end of March. It's a 3-week show, so it's very short. But we're also looking at, participating in May 5th's Red Dress Day. So we've been asking the community if they had any red dresses to donate. We're going to be putting up a display outside to honor the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So that's a very...
And so that's, again, another important role that the museum is playing that would not necessarily be a traditional museum role, but you're so immersed in the community and you're honoring the very community that you're serving and making sure that you're doing things right. I'm curious, just because, my previous guest had Afro-Indigenous heritage, and I'm wondering, have you been able to tap into any of those complexities of individuals that have lived in our community and just to be able to showcase their rich history and that diversity that's exists within their own lives? A lot of the artists that we have coming up are some of them are of course maybe status, but there's a lot of complication between identity, and I think especially because how prosecuted and how shamed they were for such a long time that I think that many people are still rediscovering what that means to have an Indigenous identity and how that it's a very personal thing, and I can't personally understand it, but I can see how it'd be such a complex issue of how to kind of get to terms with that, and I think the
the expression of art and how that's kind of a healing practice, and obviously lots of people use it as a form of expression to kind of investigate that. And I think the like things like the multicultural art show would be a great way to showcase that, because you could maybe blend your two identities together, or however you want to present it, and kind of think about how that might affect you as a person, but also other people who are also different kind of backgrounds. And identity is a very tricky
it is.
It's a very tricky thing, I think, for a lot of people. There's so many layers to identity. I think it's hard to and it can be very fluid depending on where you are and who you're with. And
absolutely. Now, when you think of the museum, if you could describe the role that the museum plays in our community, how would you describe it?
I think the museum is a platform for discussion. It's a place where people should feel safe to come and have, educated but also sometimes difficult conversations. They should think of it as a place that is safe, and we can all explore like these issues together, and that it should be a place for everybody. I think it's supposed to be from the youngest baby or toddler as a place to explore and kind of learn through touching and doing and whatever, but also it's a place for experimentation if you're looking to explore something new, a new craft, or even just like learn about where you are and sort of situate yourself in that story, or maybe you've never been here before, so you're just kind of learning from the beginning. So I think it can be many things to many people, but yeah, I think it's definitely a place for conversation and a place for connection, and hopefully people can come with their family members and all ages and kind of have those discussions about their history or where they want to go. It's kind of like an arts and culture hub. Okay. That's kind of what I think of it as.
Now that you've had the opportunity to travel the world and see such rich history from the UK to France, Italy, and so forth, and back to rural Dufferin, your rural museum, how do you see the museum evolving? And again, keeping in perspective how Dufferin County has changed and evolved over the last 10 or so years. How do you see the museum evolving to remain relevant for the community?
Yeah, I think that goes back to programming and providing people with things to do and while learning, because I think the museum is it's a place where you'd want to learn things that you can't just get from like any rec center or something. I think even though museums have a very complex history, it's staggering actually, the statistics behind museums, how many people trust museums, what they understand that we do put a lot of effort into that telling the story. Like, we do a lot of research from different perspectives. We make sure we use the objects that have these stories attached to them. So there is like an element of truth and sort of knowing that we're doing our due diligence. Right. So I think that's really interesting. But also thinking about, and I think that plays a really important role in society, because there's such, maybe I'm the only one, but I think there's a kind of some sort of strange idea of distrust in our society right now. We distrust a lot of things. So I think it's important for the museum to kind of be there for a solid thing. You can kind of be like, okay, I believe in this.
It's almost like the encyclopedia, right?
Yeah, like we have the things to back up what we're saying, and we have the the evidence, as it were. But we try to make sure that everything is educational, but also fun. Like, we want it to be a fun place. So we're doing lots of new initiatives going in the future for programming. We've started one called, for example, it's called Mini Mod. So for babies and toddlers, it's themed based on usually seasonal. So like like spring. So we'll do like ones with the birds and butterflies, and
that's exciting. Yeah, innovative.
Yeah, well, just bringing because there's a lot of people, like you said, that are coming here new, a lot of new families, young families, and how do we how do we engage them? Obviously, babies can't read labels and panels, and but we want them to feel like they belong here too. So, just something like a fun play group where parents can get together and or caregivers, doesn't have to be a parent, but anyone who wants to bring young toddlers and get them into the museum early and see that this is a fun and enjoyable place to be.
Right, and it also allows you the opportunity to explore the different exhibits that you have in the museum.
Yeah.
I believe you have an audio component as well for some elements in the museum.
Yeah. So there's lots of different ways of learning. We've got digital exhibits so that for people who are maybe, I know we're again rural, so if they can't make it out, we've got that. You can maybe look at. We have a meteorite exhibit, which is really cool about the Shelburne meteorite. You can view that from the comfort of your home. So sometimes we recognize that it's hard for some people to get out to us, so we're trying to get out to them more, and we're going to be doing that a lot more in our outreach initiatives. So trying to go to as many fairs and markets and events as we can to sort of reach people, especially if they're maybe not as mobile and can't get to us.
I love that.
So yeah.
Now, as you're going out and reaching out to the community, are you also cataloging different historical places? I know we had conversations earlier with the story of like William and Mary Gaunt and different historical Black settlers in Dufferin County. Will you be going out and almost landmarking these places so that you're almost creating a driving tour, per se, of the museum?
Yeah. So actually, our archivist Laura Camilleri has created a really cool. Basically, it's a digital map of like Dufferin with important historical places. We've got a lot online that you can look at through our online catalog that has places in it specifically. You can do a lot of research that way. We also have a lot of really cool things for kids, like a learning hub that we have different kinds of information for children, and a lot of them use it for different age groups. So we've got it like scheduled for grade level basically. And we noticed a lot, especially during COVID when it was harder to get out. They did a lot of looking at that. So I think that those kinds of tools are out there, and we definitely do a lot of historical research in situ, if that makes sense.
Okay.
And looking at cemeteries, for example. Those are a great way of telling stories, because often we know we know the whole life story. You just see like a tombstone with a birth date and a death date, but that's a whole person's story right there. And we usually hold that at the museum, especially our archivists. Yeah, so there's lots of ways of kind of thinking about history in the community.
I love that. That's exciting. So listen, I have learned a lot about museums today. This has been a very enlightening conversation. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you for sharing the history, and congratulations on your PhD. That's an amazing accomplishment.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for tuning in to In Conversation with Alethia. Until next time, stay tuned.